Hey guys, tonight we are traveling to a place where the air is thin, the history is ancient, and the breakfast requirements are frankly exhausting. We re-heading to the rugged, misty highlands of ancient Ethiopia, specifically during the height of the Aksumite Empire. Now, a little bit of a reality check before we get started. If you were actually there, you might not survive the first day, not because of some grand battle or a prowling leopard, but simply because your lower back would probably go on strike and leave your body before you even finished the first batch of flour. We are here to grind teff, the tiniest grain in the world, and turn it into the foundation of the legendary Injera flatbread. It is a process that is rhythmic, meditative, and absolutely back-breaking. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always love hearing from you while the rest of the world is quiet, so please leave a comment and tell me which city you re-in and what time it is right now. Are you tucked under a blanket in a rainy London? Or is it a quiet morning in a sun-drenched Sydney? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let us ease into tonight. Journey together. You wake up, and the first thing you notice is the cold. You lying on a woven mat inside a round, stone-walled house with a thatched roof, known as a tukul. The air smells of dry grass, cold earth, and a hint of frankincense from last night. Outside, the world is wrapped in a thick, bluish, gray mist that rolls over the Simeon Mountains like a silent ocean. You at an altitude where the clouds feel less like something in the sky and more like a damp blanket you forced to wear. Your breath hitches slightly in the thin mountain air as you push yourself up. Your muscles are already stiff, and you haven't even touched the stone yet. You look into the corner of the room, and there it is. A large woven basket filled with teff. To the uninitiated, it looks like a pile of reddish-brown dust. But this is the lifeblood of the highlands. In the mainstream of world history, the kingdom of Aksum was a powerhouse, standing proudly alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the four great empires of the ancient world. They controlled the trade routes from the Red Sea to the African interior, and they minted their own gold coins. But while the kings were busy carving massive stone obelisks to show off their power, you, and millions like you, were busy with the much more important task of making sure the empire didn't starve. Because you can eat a gold coin. And you certainly can. Eat an obelisk, no matter how impressive it looks in the morning light. You reach out and run your fingers through the teff. It's incredibly smooth, almost like sand. Here is a niche, slightly quirky fact for you. The word teff is believed to come from the Amharic word tefa, which literally means lost. This is because the seeds are so tiny, smaller than a poppy seed, that if you drop a handful of them in the dirt, you might as well say goodbye to them forever. You have a better chance of finding a specific needle in a haystack than recovering a spilled bag of teff. It takes about 150 grains of teff to equal the weight of a single kernel of wheat. It's the ultimate micro-food, and tonight, you have to turn thousands of these lost seeds into a silk-smooth powder. You drag the heavy sack toward the center of the hut. You hear the soft shesh of the grains, shifting against the woven grass. It's a gentle sound, but it's the beginning of a very long day. You realize that your entire social status, your family's health, and your reputation as a functional human being depend on your ability to master the stone. This brings us to a point that academic historians are still debating today exactly when did the ancient Ethiopians start fermenting this grain to make injera. Some scholars argue that teff has been cultivated for over 6,000 years, making it one of the earliest domesticated plants on the planet. However, others insist that the specific sour, fermented crepe style we know today didn't fully evolve until much later, perhaps even toward the end of the Aksumite period. The history books aren't quite sure if the people of the early Aksumite era were eating a porridge, a flatbread, or something in between. But as you look at the grinding slab waiting for you, You not thinking about archaeology. You rethinking about the sheer physics of what's coming next. You step outside for a moment to clear the sleep from your head. The sun is just starting to burn through the mist, turning the highlands into a landscape of gold and shadows. You see the massive, jagged silhouettes of the mountains in the distance, and closer to home, the silhouettes of juniper trees. The world is beautiful, silent, and incredibly demanding. There are no machines here, no electric mills, no prepackaged flour. There is only you, the grain, and a very heavy piece of volcanic rock. You take a deep breath, feeling the crisp, sharp air fill your lungs, and head back inside. You kneel down on the packed dirt floor. The floor is cool and hard, swept clean with a bundle of twigs. In front of you is the madga, the large, slightly concave grinding stone. It is a slab of dark basalt, heavy enough that it took 2 people to move it into the house. It has been worn smooth by generations of your ancestors, but it still has enough grit to do the job. Beside it lies the muro, the smaller, hand-held stone that you will use to do the actual crushing. It's shaped like a thick loaf of bread, perfectly fitted to the span of your palms. You feel the weight of the muro in your hands. It's cold, smooth, and unforgiving. You realize that for the next several hours, this stone will be an extension of your own body. You aren't just a person grinding grain. You are the motor of the house. You take a small handful of teff, not too much, just enough to cover the center of the slab, and let it trickle through your fingers. It sounds like a tiny dry rain falling on the basalt. The first movement is always the hardest. You have to lean your entire body forward, using the weight of your shoulders and your core, not just your arms. If you just use your arms, you last 20 minutes. You push the hand stone forward, feeling the crunch of the tiny seeds beneath the rock. Crrrk. It has a sharp, satisfying sound. Then you pull it back, dragging the grain along the surface. Sweep forward again. Crrrk. Pull back, sweep. You restarting to find the rhythm. It's a slow, steady pulse that matches the beating of your heart. The mist outside is fading. The hut is warming up, and the first few flecks of reddish brown powder are starting to accumulate at the far end of the stone. You are the bridge between the wild grass of the field and the soft bread of the table. You are a part of a cycle that has been turning since the dawn of time. And as the rhythm takes hold, you realize that the story of Aksum isn't written in gold or stone. It is being ground out, right here, between 2 pieces of rock and the strength of your own 2 hands. You pause for a second, your hands still resting on the cold basalt of the muro, and you look down at the pile of grain you just committed your morning to. It's actually quite ridiculous when you think about it. You are a citizen of one of the most sophisticated empires on the planet, a place where people trade in ivory and frankincense, and yet your entire survival depends on a seed so small it looks like a mistake. You pick up a single grain, or at least you try to, but it slides under your fingernail and disappears. This is teff, the tiny agricultural giant of the Horn of Africa. If wheat is the king of the north and rice is the queen of the east, teff is the undisputed, slightly eccentric wizard of the Ethiopian highlands. It's rugged. It's ancient, and it has absolutely no interest in making your life easy. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your memory right now is that teff, or Eragrostis teff, is a C4 cereal grass. In non-science nerd terms, that means it's a high-performance plant, designed by nature to thrive when everything else is giving up. It handles high altitudes, thin air, and temperamental rains better than almost any other grain. It's been the staple of the Ethiopian diet since at least the 1st millennium BCE, while the rest of the ancient world was experimenting with barley and emmer wheat. The people of the highlands looked at this wild grass and realized that although the seeds were microscopic, they were packed with more nutrition than a Roman legionary. Steak dinner. It was a strategic choice. Teff is drought resistant and stays viable in storage for years, which is great for an empire, but not so great for the person who has to turn it into flour. You run your hand through the basket again, noticing the color. There are two types here, the white teff, which is actually more of a pale cream, and the red teff, which is a deep, earthy brown. You know that the white teff is the high-status stuff, the grain that the Aksumite nobles and the priesthood demand for their tables. The red teff is for the common folk, like you. But honestly, you've always preferred the red. It has a deeper, nuttier flavor, even if it doesn't look as refined when it's cooked. You recurrently mixing them, creating a blend that will produce a perfectly balanced injera. But as you look at the thousands, no, millions of tiny seeds, you realize that because they are so small, you can actually hull them. You have to grind the whole thing, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. Here is a niche, slightly weird fact for you to contemplate while you start your second set of grinds. Teff is essentially pest-proof. Because the seeds are so tiny, they are almost invisible to the common grain weevils that plague wheat and corn. Even more impressively, locusts, those biblical nightmares that can strip a kingdom bare in a single afternoon, usually ignore teff fields because the stalks are too thin and the seeds too small to be worth the effort. It's like being so small that the universe forgets you, there, which is a pretty solid survival strategy in a region prone to ecological chaos. You holding a biological bunker in your hand, a grain that has survived the rise and fall of dozens of kings simply by being too tiny to notice. This brings us to another point of academic controversy that keeps historians and botanists bickering over their research papers: the domestication timeline. Academic historians are still debating exactly how teff went from a wild highland grass to a domesticated staple. Some argue that it happened as early as 4000 BCE, citing ancient pollen samples found in cave deposits. Others insist that it wasn't truly industrialized as a crop until the pre-Aksumite Mount Kingdom around 800 BCE. There's even a heated argument about its wild ancestor, Eragrostis pilosa. Did humans selectively breed it for size? Or did the unique volcanic soil of the Rift Valley do the work for us? Looking at the grain on your stone, it's hard to believe anyone selected this for size. If they did, they clearly had a very strange sense of humor. The snarky part of your brain is currently pointing out that if this is a superfood, it should really do more of the work itself. You lean back into the rhythm, CRRK sweep. The teff is stubborn, because you regrinding the whole seed, you redealing with a lot of fiber. It doesn't shatter like a dried pea, it resists. It wants to slide across the stone rather than be crushed by it. You have to apply a very specific kind of downward pressure, a grinding lean that targets the center of the basalt. You can feel the friction generating a tiny bit of heat under the muro. The smell is starting to change. The dry, hay-like scent of the raw grain is being replaced by a faint, sweet, malty aroma as the oils inside the seeds are released. You look at the basket and realize you barely made a dent. You need enough flour for a 3-day fermentation, and at this rate, you'll be grinding until the moon comes up. You think about the sheer scale of this task across the empire. Right now, in every household from the port of Adulis to the capital of Aksum, someone is doing exactly what you are doing. The entire energy of a civilization is being funneled through these stones. It's an invisible infrastructure. The kings might get the credit for the trade routes and the wars, but the empire is actually held together by the collective friction of 1,000,000 grinding stones. Without this dust, the army doesn't march, the priests don't pray, and the stonemasons don't have the strength to lift the next obelisk. The sun is higher now, and a single ray of light pierces the smoke hole of your tukul, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. You realize that half of those motes are probably teff flour. You rebreathing it in. It's coating your eyelashes, and it's settling into the creases of your skin. You are becoming one with the grain. There is a certain poetic beauty to it. but your lower back is currently screaming that poetry is for people who don't have to work for a living. You shift your weight, moving from your knees to a half-crouch to save your joints. You notice a small beetle crawling across the dirt floor toward your stone. You gently nudge it away with your toe. In this world, everything wants a piece of the teff. It's a concentrated battery of iron, calcium, and protein. If you were a traveler, a single handful of this flour mixed with water could keep you walking for 2 days. It's the ultimate survival ration. But you aren't traveling. You staying right here, locked in a dance with a basalt slab. You take another handful of grain and spread it across the stone. The seeds are so light, they feel like nothing. But the stone is heavy, and the work is real. You think about the lost grain, and you realize that it is just the seeds that get lost. It is the time, centuries of human hours ground into the dust of the highlands. But then you think about the smell of fresh injera, the sour, bubbly, spongy perfection that is waiting at the end of this road, and you find the strength to push the stone forward one more time. CRRK, the wizard of the highlands, is starting to give in. The red, brown dust is growing thicker. You not just a person anymore. You a part of the geology of Ethiopia. You lift the hand stone once more. But before you drive it forward, you take a moment to really look at the tools of your trade. You didn't just pick these up at a local ancient market on a whim. In the ancient Ethiopian highlands, a woman's grinding stone, the madga, is less like a kitchen appliance and more like a family member. One that happened to be born in a volcano and weighs as much as a small goat. You run your palm over the surface of the large lower slab. It's dark, almost charcoal-colored, and when you touch it, it feels cold and slightly pitted, like the skin of an orange made of iron. This is basalt, the literal bedrock of the Aksumite diet, and finding the perfect pair of stones is a quest that usually involves a lot of lifting and an equal amount of spiritual intuition. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your belt tonight is that the Aksumites were, hands down, the greatest stone masons of ancient sub-Saharan Africa. While you hear grinding grain on a basalt slab, just a few miles away, engineers are moving massive granite blocks to build the palaces of the elite and carving those giant multi-story stelae that look like stone skyscrapers. But while the kings cared about granite and marble, the common people cared about volcanic basalt. Ethiopia sits right on the edge of the Great Rift Valley, a place where the Earth's crust has been tearing itself apart for millions of years, spewing out lava that cools into this incredibly dense, hard, and slightly abrasive rock. Basalt is the perfect material for grinding teff because it's hard enough not to wear down into the flour. Nobody wants a side of rock dust with their dinner, but porous enough to hold the tiny grains in place while you crush them. You reach for your muro, the handheld stone, and you notice how it's been shaped. It's slightly curved on the bottom, a saddle shape that has been worn down by decades of your mother's and grandmother's effort. Here is a niche, slightly quirky fact for you. These stones are not meant to stay smooth. In fact, a smooth grinding stone is a useless grinding stone. Every few weeks, you have to perform a ritual called pecking. You take a very hard, pointed quartz rock, and you spend an hour rhythmically tapping the surface of the basalt, chipping away tiny flakes to create a new, rough tooth on the stone. It sounds like 1,000 tiny hammers hitting a bell. If you don't peck your stone, the teff seeds will just slide around like they on an ice rink. And you spend the whole day achieving nothing but a very polished rock and an empty stomach. You essentially sharpening a piece of the earth, ensuring the friction remains high enough to turn the wizard grain into dust. As you resume the grinding motion, lean, push, pull, repeat, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps archaeologists bickering over their campfire coffee. The diffusion versus innovation debate of the saddle quern. Most history books will tell you that this specific type of grinding technology, the saddle-shaped stone, was a universal human invention that popped up in Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia around the same time. However, some scholars argue that the Aksumite maga is fundamentally different in its ergonomics and stone choice, suggesting that it was a purely indigenous development, refined over thousands of years by Afro-Asiatic speakers in the highlands. There is a fierce, ongoing debate about whether the agricultural tech of the Aksumite Empire was imported from the Red Sea trade routes, or if it was a homegrown miracle of highland engineering. Looking at the calluses forming on your palms, you suspect the indigenous crowd is right. This stone feels like it was designed by someone who knew exactly how much the highland wind can bite and how much energy you need to squeeze out of a single handful of teff. The snarky part of your brain, the part that's currently checking the time despite the fact that clocks won't be invented for another 1,000 years, is pointing out that you are essentially a manual laborer for a rock, you refeeding it, you resharpening it, and you removing your body to satisfy its hunger for grain. You realize that your entire physical posture has been sculpted by this basalt slab. You have the Aksumite shoulder, a slight forward roll of the muscles that comes from leaning into the stone day after day. It's a badge of survival. You look at the mirror and notice a faint red-purple stain on the side. That S from the red teff you ground yesterday. The stone remembers every meal you've ever made. You take a small brush made of stiff grass and sweep the freshly ground flour into a pile at the end of the madga. The powder is getting finer now. You pick up a pinch and rub it between your thumb and forefinger. It feels like silk, but colder. You know that if the flour is too coarse, the injera will be gritty and develop those beautiful eyes or bubbles during fermentation. So you pour a little more raw grain onto the center and start again. C-R-R-R-K. Sweep. The sound is no longer a harsh crunch. It's becoming a low, rhythmic hum. It's the song of the mountain being turned into the sustenance of the home. Here is a slightly weird fact about basalt, because it was born in fire. Some of the local elders believe it has a heat memory. They say that a stone that has been used for many years grinds warmer flour, which makes the bread rise faster and taste sweeter. You don't know about the magic, but you do know that the stone is physically warming up under your hands. The friction is a form of slow-motion cooking. You can feel the energy of your own muscles being transferred into the dust. You are literally charging the grain with your own vitality. You look toward the corner of the hut where your family, soldier, retired grinding stone sits. It's been worn down so thin that it's almost transparent in the middle, a relic of your great-grandmother's life. In your culture, when a stone finally breaks or becomes too thin to use, it isn't just thrown away. It's often buried under the threshold of the house or used as a foundation stone for a new tukul. The stone that fed the family becomes the stone that protects the family. A beautiful heavy continuity. You realize that you aren't just grinding for today's lunch. You are adding your own layer of wear and tear to a physical history book that stays in the kitchen. The sun is pouring through the doorway now, and the hut is filled with the fine, golden haze of teff dust. It's a sensory overload. The smell of the warming basalt, the sight of the glittering quartz teeth, and the feel of the silk-fine powder. You retired. Your knees are starting to complain about the hard floor, and your hair is probably 20% flour by weight, but the rhythm has you. You don't need a podcast or a radio. The stone is talking to you, telling you when to push harder and when to ease off. You are the heart of the machine, the priestess of the volcanic slab, and the dust is starting to pile up. The lost seeds have been found, crushed, and reborn as the promise of a feast. You take a breath of the flowery air and drive the muro forward once more. One more handful, one more sweep. The basalt is satisfied, and so, for a fleeting moment, are you.
You take a momentary breather, sitting back on your heels as you watch the first real pile of flour accumulate at the edge of the stone. It's a moment of quiet triumph, though your triceps are already sending you a very clear message that they would prefer to be doing literally anything else. You reach out and touch the pile. It's soft, impossibly soft, and it has a warmth to it that comes directly from the friction of the basalt. This is the first dance of the dust. In the dim light of the tukul, the fine particles of teff hang in the air, caught in the single shaft of sunlight that has managed to fight its way through the thatch. It looks like a storm of microscopic gold, a shimmering haze that coats everything it touches. If you were a high-ranking noble in the palace of Aksum, you'd probably call this a nuisance. But here, on the floor of your house, this dust is the most valuable thing you own. It's the sound of silence turning into sustenance. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your mental archive is that the Aksumites were masters of surplus. While the Roman Empire was constantly worrying about its bread and circuses, and the grain shipments from Egypt, the Aksumite Empire was built on a much more local, decentralized form of security. Archaeologists have discovered massive, bell-shaped underground grain pits across the highlands, some lined with straw and sealed with clay to keep the moisture out. These were the federal reserves of the ancient world. A successful harvest of teff didn't just mean a full belly for the farmer, it meant the empire had the stability to send its merchants across the Indian Ocean to trade with India and its diplomats to the courts of Byzantium. You aren't just grinding for your family, you are the microscopic power source for a global trade network. Without your morning dust dance, the ships in the Red Sea stop moving. You pick up the murrow again, and as you slide it forward, you notice the way the flour interacts with your skin. Here is a niche, slightly weird, and honestly quite impressive fact for you: teff is a nutritional powerhouse, but its most famous attribute in the ancient world was its iron content. However, there's a bit of a secret ingredient in your flour that modern science has only recently started to investigate. Historians and nutritionists have noted that people in the Ethiopian highlands traditionally have some of the highest iron levels in the world. But here's the kicker: it's not just the grain. Because you are grinding on a volcanic basalt stone, tiny, microscopic flecks of the stone itself are being worn away and mixed into the flour. You are essentially fortifying your bread with the mineral wealth of the earth itself. You're literally eating the mountains of Ethiopia to stay strong. It's probably the most metal breakfast in human history. As you lean back into the rhythm, push, crush, sweep, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps food historians throwing metaphorical sourdough starters at each other: the porridge versus bread debate. Most textbooks treat Injera as the eternal, unchanging face of Ethiopian cuisine. But some scholars argue that for much of the Aksumite period, that the national dish wasn't a flatbread at all. They suggest that the fermentation technology required to make the bubbly, spongy Injera we love was a high-status secret, and that most people were actually eating a thick, dense teff porridge or a dry, unleavened biscuit. The debate is essentially: was Injera a revolutionary invention that suddenly appeared to feed the growing cities of Aksum, or did it slowly bubble up over thousands of years of trial and error? Looking at the fine dust on your stone, you find it hard to believe anyone would settle for porridge when they could have the soft, sour lace of a perfect Injera. The snarky part of your brain, the part that's currently wondering if your knees will ever unbend, is pointing out that a modern gym would charge you a monthly fee for this kind of functional training. You've got the Aksumite squat down to a science. You're using your core to stabilize, your lats to pull, and your chest to push. It's a full-body workout that would make a CrossFit coach weep with envy. But instead of a protein shake at the end, you just get a face full of flour and the responsibility of not letting a single grain go to waste. You notice a stray seed that has bounced off the stone and is sitting near your toe. You carefully pick it up and put it back in the to-grind pile. In this house, we respect the lost grain. Every seed is a heartbeat. You're starting to see the village wake up through the doorway. You hear the rhythmic thump-thump of your neighbor's grinding stone echoing through the thin morning air. It's a communal symphony. In Aksum, you never grind in true silence. There's always the sound of someone else, a few huts away, keeping the same beat. It's the social media of the 4th century. The speed of your grind tells the neighbors if you're energetic, tired, or perhaps a little bit grumpy. You purposely speed up for a few seconds, just to let the village know you're the first one to reach the fine powder stage. It's a tiny, silent boast in a world made of stone. The dust is everywhere now. It's in your eyebrows, giving you a prematurely wise, gray-haired look. It's in your nose, making you want to sneeze, which would be a tactical disaster of epic proportions. Imagine the cloud. You realize that the dust dance is actually a test of your breath control. You have to breathe in a very specific, shallow way to avoid inhaling half your harvest. You're becoming a master of grinding yoga. Every movement is deliberate. Every breath is calculated. The world outside is moving toward the chaos of the day, but here, in the circle of the Madga, everything is focused on the transition from solid to shadow. You look at your hands. They are ghostly white, the fine teff dust settling into every line of your palms. You realize that your skin is being exfoliated by the volcanic grit, making your hands feel smoother than they have any right to be. It's the ancient Highland spa treatment, mercury-free and 100% organic. But the spa has a high entry price. You can feel a dull throb in the base of your spine, a reminder that the earth doesn't give up its secrets easily. You have to earn every gram of that red-brown powder. The first pile of flour is finally big enough to be moved into the storage jar. You use a clean, dried gourd to scoop it up. It feels weightless, like you're scooping up a handful of clouds. As the flour hits the bottom of the ceramic jar, it makes a soft, muffled sound, the sound of safety. You've finished the first dance. The morning is no longer a threat, it's a promise. You reach for the next handful of raw grain, feeling the cool, sandy seeds trickle through your fingers. The sun is fully up now, the mist is gone, and the lost seeds are waiting for their turn to join the dance. You lean forward, the basalt stone cool against your palms, and the rhythm starts again. Crrrk. Sweep. The empire is awake, and you are the one keeping its heart beating, one dust mote at a time. You're back at it, your hands gripping the murrow with a familiarity that's starting to feel a bit too permanent. If you were looking at your reflection in a pool of water right now, you probably wouldn't recognize yourself. You've got a fine dusting of teff on your forehead like war paint, and your shoulders are hunched in a way that suggests you've spent the last 1,000 years trying to push a mountain. But something has changed in the last hour. The initial, "this is exhausting," phase has faded, replaced by what the elders call the stone groove. You aren't just fighting the basalt anymore, you've entered a mechanical melody where the friction between the rock and your own bones is creating a rhythmic symphony. It's a song made of grit and determination, played out on the stage of a volcanic slab. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your apron is that the Aksumite Empire wasn't just a civilization of grand monuments and gold coins, it was a civilization of rhythmic labor. While the historical records are obsessed with the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that ancient Greek travel guide that describes Aksum's trade in emeralds and silk, the actual engine of the empire was the domestic soundscape. If you could fly a drone over the highlands in the 4th century, the dominant sound wouldn't be the shouting of soldiers or the chanting of priests, it would be the low, percussive crrrk of a million women grinding grain. This was the white noise of an empire. It provided the steady beat for political stability. In Aksum, a silent house was a dead house. Your constant push and pull is the background music for the entire Red Sea trade network. You feel the murrow vibrate in your palms. It's a deep, low-frequency hum that travels up your arms and settles in your chest. This brings us to a niche, slightly quirky fact for the night, the stone whisperers. In ancient Highland tradition, the grinding stone wasn't seen as an inanimate object. It was believed that after years of use, the stone began to learn the secrets of the family it fed. There are old stories of women who claimed they could hear warnings of drought or news of a distant relative's success in the pitch of the grind. If the stone sounded hollow, bad news was coming. If it sang a bright note, the harvest would be plenty. You listen closely to your own stone. Right now, it sounds like it's complaining about the quality of the breakfast you haven't eaten yet. It's a grumpy, heavy sound, but at least it's consistent. As you lean your weight into the forward stroke, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps archaeologists bickering over their carbon dating charts, the ergot theory. Some scholars have hypothesized that ancient teff, like rye in medieval Europe, was sometimes infected with the claviceps fungus, better known as ergot. For the uninitiated, ergot contains lysergic acid, a precursor to LSD. The theory suggests that the visions and high-intensity spiritual experiences recorded in Aksumite religious texts might have been fueled by accidental microdosing of hallucinogenic teff flower. Academic historians are still debating this, often arguing over whether the eyes of the Injera were just bubbles of CO2 or gateways to a different dimension. Looking at the swirling patterns of the dust in the sunlight, you're starting to wonder if the stone groove is actually just you getting a little bit high on the atmosphere of the grind. The snarky part of your brain, the part that's currently wondering why you didn't just apprentice to a blacksmith instead, is pointing out that you are essentially a biological metronome. You are performing a repetitive motion task that a modern factory could do in 3 seconds. But there is a strange, hypnotic beauty in it. When you hit the flow state, the pain in your lower back becomes a distant rumor. Your world shrinks until there is only the push and the pull. You aren't thinking about the taxes you owe the king, or the fact that your roof needs rethatching. You are just counting the grains. You've moved beyond the work and into the meditation. This is the Aksumite version of a high-end spa retreat, except instead of a massage, you get the absolute certainty that you are going to be very sore tomorrow. You notice the way your wrists are moving. There is a flick at the end of each pull, a quick rotation that sweeps the flower toward the edge of the madga. It's a technique you've been learning since you were 5, watching your mother do it with her eyes closed. Here is a slightly weird fact about the mechanics of the grind: because teff is so high in fiber, the grinding stone actually polishes itself over time. The basalt doesn't get duller, it gets greasier. The natural oils from the teff seeds act as a lubricant, creating a surface that is both abrasive and slick. It's a self-maintaining industrial system. You realize that your stone is actually in better shape now than when you started this morning. It's getting seasoned by your sweat and the wizard grain. The sun has moved across the doorway, and the shadows in the tukul are getting longer. You look at the pile of flour in your storage jar. It's halfway full. You've ground enough for the first soak, the preliminary fermentation stage. You realize that the mechanical melody has a biological purpose. The heat generated by the stone, the fine texture of the powder, and even the microscopic basalt dust are all preparing the teff for the next chapter, the fermentation. You are pre-activating the grain. You stop for a moment to wipe your face with a piece of cotton cloth. You're covered in a layer of red-brown dust that's starting to itch. You look at your hands and notice that your stone groove has left its mark, the skin on your knuckles is slightly red from the friction, and your thumb has a tiny, emerging callus. You feel a strange sense of belonging. This callus is your ID card. It proves that you are a producer, a person of the stone, a citizen of the highlands who knows how to fight for their food. You take a deep breath of the air, which now smells intensely of toasted stone and dry malt. You can hear the sounds of the village getting louder, the bleating of goats, the shouting of children, the clatter of a passing merchant's cart heading toward the obelisk plaza. The world is busy, but your work is foundational. You reach for the final handful of grain for the morning. You let the tiny, lost seeds trickle through your fingers one last time, watching them land on the dark basalt. You drive the muro forward with a renewed energy. CRRRK. The melody is reaching its crescendo. The dust is dancing, the stone is humming, and the empire is waiting for its bread. You realize that the mechanical melody isn't just about the noise, it's about the fact that you've successfully turned a volcanic rock and a wild grass into the possibility of another day. You pull the stone back, sweep, and scoop the last of the morning's flour into the jar. The grind is done. Your body is screaming, but your heart is quiet. You've survived the stone, and now, the water is waiting. You stop for a second, leaning your forehead against the cool, sweat-slicked handle of the muro, and you realize that your body is currently making a formal list of grievances. Your lower back isn't just aching, it's practically writing a resignation letter and looking for a better gig in a different century. If you could see yourself right now, you'd realize that you've accidentally stumbled upon the ultimate ancient Ethiopian beauty secret. The fine, red-brown teff dust has mixed with your sweat to create a thick, earthy paste that coats your face, your arms, and your neck. It's like a full-body mud mask that you didn't ask for and definitely can't wash off until the job is done. You feel like a clay statue that has come to life only to perform the most repetitive task in human history. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your dusty pocket is that the Aksumite domestic economy was almost entirely built on this kind of invisible, unrelenting labor. While the historical chronicles are busy gushing over the Aksumite architecture, or the ivory trade, the reality of daily life happened inside the tukul. These houses were more than just shelters, they were miniature factories. The layout of an ancient Aksumite home was designed around the grinding stone. It was the centerpiece of the kitchen zone, positioned where the light from the door would hit the stone but the wind wouldn't blow the precious flour away. Every morning, the empire's strength was renewed not by soldiers training in the field, but by millions of people in these stone and thatch workshops, grinding out the calories that fueled the next generation. You aren't just a homemaker in the modern sense, you are a vital infrastructure point. If the grinding stops, the empire's gears grind to a halt. You wipe a smear of teff paste from your eye, and you notice how it feels against your skin. Here is a niche, slightly quirky fact for you, that teff dust actually served a very practical, if accidental, purpose. In the harsh, high-altitude sun of the Ethiopian highlands, where the UV rays are intense enough to peel the paint off a modern car, a thick coating of grain dust functioned as a natural sunscreen and insect repellent. It created a physical barrier against the biting flies that followed the cattle and a cooling layer that helped regulate body temperature while working near the hearth. You're essentially wearing a high-tech, organic, highland foundation that protects you while you work. It might itch like crazy, and you might look like you've been rolling in a spice cabinet, but in the 4th century, this was the peak of protective gear. As you resume the grind, push, pull, groan, repeat, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps physical anthropologists arguing over their skeletal collections. There is a long-standing, skeletal marker, debate. When archaeologists dig up the remains of Aksumite citizens, they often find specific wear patterns on the knee joints and the vertebrae of the lower back. For decades, the official word was that these were clear signs of grinder's back, the physical toll of leaning over the madga for 6 hours a day. However, a newer school of researchers argues that these markers are too generalized. They suggest that the same wear patterns could come from weaving, pottery making, or even specific styles of dance. Academic historians are still debating this, often arguing over whether we can truly read a person's daily chore list just by looking at their bones. Looking at your own shaking knees right now, you find it hard to believe anyone could mistake this specific kind of torture for a fun night of dancing. The snarky part of your brain, the part that's currently wondering if the Aksumite Empire had any concept of sick leave, is pointing out that your lower back is currently issuing a final ultimatum. If you don't shift your weight soon, your spine might actually snap like a dry juniper branch. You try to adjust your position, moving from a kneeling stance to a wide, awkward squat. It's not much better, but it buys you another 10 minutes of productivity. You look at the pile of grain left in the basket and realize you've reached the halfway point of despair. This is the moment when you've done enough to be tired, but not enough to be finished. It's the spiritual test of the highlands. Do you give up and make a very thin porridge, or do you push through for the glory of a perfect injera? You decide to push. You find a new rhythm, one that uses the momentum of your entire torso. You start to think of the muro not as a heavy rock, but as a passenger you're giving a ride to. You talk to the stone. You tell it about your day. You complain to it about the price of salt. Surprisingly, the stone doesn't argue back, it just keeps humming its basalt song. Crrrk. Sweep. The dust rises again, dancing in the light. You realize that your snark is actually a survival mechanism. If you didn't laugh at the absurdity of grinding thousands of microscopic seeds with a volcanic boulder, you'd probably just sit down and cry. And in Aksum, there's no time for crying, tears would just turn your flour into a sticky mess. You notice that your hands are starting to look different. The fine dust has filled in every line of your palms, making them look like a topographic map of the mountains outside. You realize that the history you're experiencing isn't just in the monuments or the coins, it's being etched into your own anatomy. Every push of the stone is a stroke of a pen, writing the story of your endurance into your muscles. You're becoming a physical record of the Aksumite way of life. You're strong, you're dusty, and you're incredibly focused on a target that is smaller than a grain of sand. The smell of the room has shifted. The dry, dusty scent is now being joined by the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's house and the distant, sweet aroma of brewing coffee, though in this era, the coffee is likely being eaten as a fatty snack rather than drunk as a latte. It's a reminder that you aren't alone in your labor. The entire village is a giant, synchronized machine of effort. You take a deep, shaky breath, feeling the grit in your lungs, and lean into the stone one more time. The lost seeds are surrendering. The pile of flour is growing. You're covered in mud paste, your back is on fire, and you're pretty sure your knees will never be the same, but you're doing it. You're grinding the foundation of a civilization. One more handful. One more sweep. The snark is quiet now, there's only the stone and the dust. You wipe a fresh bead of sweat from your chin, leaving another dark streak of teff paste across your jaw, but as you look down at the growing mound of flour, something stops you. The sun has climbed high enough now that the light hitting the interior of your tukul is direct and unforgiving, and under this brilliant glare, the flour isn't just a muddy brown anymore. It has developed a strange, almost shimmering, iridescent purple hue. You blink, thinking perhaps the thin mountain air is finally playing tricks on your tired eyes, but no, the dust at the base of your basalt stone is glowing with a deep, royal violet tint. You realize you aren't just grinding a source of carbohydrates, you are essentially milling a jar of liquid minerals. You've moved beyond the food stage and entered the pharmaceutical stage of your morning chores. The mainstream historical fact you should anchor yourself to is that the Ethiopian highlands are a geological anomaly, a massive plateau of volcanic rock that is incredibly rich in minerals, particularly iron. Because teff has such a high seed-coat-to-volume ratio, meaning there's more skin than insides in every tiny grain, you are consuming a massive amount of the plant's mineral storage. In the ancient world, while the Egyptians were struggling with anemia and the Romans were getting lead poisoning from their plumbing, the people of the Aksumite Empire were walking around with blood so iron-rich it was practically magnetic. This high iron content is what allowed your ancestors to thrive at 10,000 feet, where the oxygen is so scarce a commoner from the coast would be gasping for breath just standing still. You are the original Iron Man of the 4th century, fueled by the purple dust of the volcanic soil. You reach down and run a pinch of the purple-tinted flour between your fingers. It feels cold, like the stone it came from, but it smells warm. This leads us to a niche, slightly quirky, and very high-status fact for the night. The color of your flour was essentially your social ID card. While we're grinding the red and purple varieties today, the white teff flour, which is more of a pale ivory, was so rare and difficult to grow that it was reserved for the highest echelons of the Aksumite priesthood and the royal family. There are ancient accounts suggesting that a guest's importance could be measured by how purple or white the bread was. If your host served you a deep violet injera, they were saying you were a sturdy, reliable friend of the earth. If it was white, you were a VIP who probably didn't know how to use a grinding stone. You look at your purple-stained knuckles and feel a surge of commoner's pride. You might not be a prince, but your blood is going to be a lot stronger than theirs by the time this basket is empty. As you lean back into the rhythm, push, crush, sweep, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps historians bickering over their archaeological dinner tables, the warrior flower debate. Academic historians are still debating whether the rapid expansion of the Aksumite Empire into the Arabian Peninsula and the Sudanese plains was actually a biological conquest, fueled by teff. One school of thought argues that Aksumite soldiers were physically superior because their red teff diet provided them with sustained energy and rapid muscle recovery that their barley-eating enemies couldn't match. Others, however, argue that this is nutritional determinism, and that the empire's success was purely a matter of superior iron weaponry and trade politics. The debate is essentially, did the Aksumites win because of their swords or because of the purple iron in their bellies? Looking at the sheer physical power you're currently using to move a 20-pound rock, you're starting to think the nutritionists might be onto something. The snarky part of your brain, the part that is currently calculating how many more thrusts it will take to finish this handful, is pointing out that you are essentially a 4th-century version of a high-end juice bar. You are cold-pressing a superfood using a volcanic rock. If you were doing this today, you'd be charging $20 a bowl and calling it Highland Mineral Fusion. You realize that the purple in the flower is actually an indicator of high levels of polyphenol and antioxidants, the kind of things modern people pay a fortune for in tiny plastic bottles. But here, you don't get a fancy label or a glass straw. You just get the stone grip and a very sore set of oblique muscles. You notice the way the purple dust has settled into the fine hairs on your arms, making you look like some sort of ancient, mineral-based alien. The shadows are beginning to shift again, and the village is reaching its midday peak of activity. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of a weaver's loom from 2 huts down, and it almost matches the beat of your murrow. You realize that the history you are living is a symphony of these small, colored moments. The white of the cotton, the gold of the king's coins, and the mysterious purple of your teff. You feel a strange sense of responsibility toward this color. You have to make sure the grind is consistent, so the purple doesn't turn into a muddy gray. You are a technician of the spectrum, ensuring that the blood of the grain is released perfectly. Here is a slightly weird fact about that purple hue. The ancient Aksumites believed that the darker and more vibrant the color of the teff flower, the more active the ancestors were in the soil. They would often take a handful of the most purple dust from the first grind and scatter it near the threshold of the tukul as a gift to the spirits of the land. They saw the color as a sign of the earth's life force, the Vmauri of the highlands. You find yourself being extra careful with the dust now, not just because you're hungry, but because you don't want to offend the spirits of the volcano. You're essentially performing a ritual of geology every time you move your arms. You've reached the bottom of the first bag. You look at your storage jar, and it's finally looking substantial. The purple-brown powder is leveled off at the top, looking like a miniature version of the flat-topped mesas that surround the city of Aksum. You realize that you've successfully captured the essence of the mountain. You've taken something that looks like dust and turned it into the potential for life. Your back is a map of pain, your face is a teff mud mask, and your arms are vibrating with a phantom rhythm that won't stop even when you do. But you are rich in iron. You are rich in history. And you are finally, mercifully, ready for a break. You stand up slowly, your joints letting out a series of cracks that sound like your grinding stone is finally snapping in half. You walk to the door of the tukul and look out at the Aksumite sky. It's a deep, brilliant blue that provides a perfect contrast to the purple dust on your skin. You feel a surge of vitality that you know comes directly from the iron in your breath. The morning of the stone is coming to an end, and the afternoon of the water is about to begin. You take one last look at the jade-like mortar sitting in the corner and smile. The tiny seeds have been lost to the stone, only to be found again as the foundation of your strength. You take a deep breath of the mountain air, feeling the weight of the minerals in your lungs, and prepare for the next chapter. The purple mountain has been moved. You stand in the doorway of your tukul, leaning against the rough-hewn stone frame to give your spine a moment to remember what straight feels like. As you wipe a mixture of purple teff dust and sweat from your brow, you look out across the plateau. The mist has long since burned away, leaving a world so sharp and clear it looks like it was carved from glass. And there, standing in the distance like a row of giant, frozen fingers reaching for the heavens, are the great stelae of Aksum. They are massive, monolithic pillars of solid granite, some of them towering nearly 80 feet into the air. In the shimmering heat of the Ethiopian afternoon, they cast long, cold shadows across the city, their gray surfaces etched with windows and doors that will never open. You realize that while you've been hunched over a 3-foot slab of basalt, your neighbors have been out there, wrestling with a skyscraper made of a single rock. The mainstream historical fact you should anchor yourself to is that these obelisks, or stelae, are the absolute architectural signature of the Aksumite Empire. They aren't just pretty rocks, they are the tomb markers of the elite, the ultimate status symbols for kings who wanted to make sure the world never forgot their names. The largest one, known as the Great Stele, originally stood over 100 feet tall and weighed more than 500 tons. That's roughly the weight of 2 modern blue whales, all carved from a single piece of granite and dragged miles from a quarry. It's a staggering display of organized labor and engineering ego. But as you look at them, you realize a simple truth: the men who carved those stones and the laborers who hauled them into place were all fueled by the very grain you're currently turning into dust. You are the silent contractor providing the biological fuel for the most ambitious construction project in Africa. You walk back to your stone, but you find yourself glancing out the small, square window of the tukul every few minutes. You're watching the way the shadows of the stele move across the valley floor. Here is a niche, slightly weird fact for you: if you look closely at the carvings on those massive stones, you'll see they are designed to look like multi-story Aksumite buildings. They have fake doors with fake handles, fake windows with fake shutters, and even fake wooden support beams, known as monkey heads, protruding from the stone. It's the ancient world's version of a prop city. The kings weren't just building markers, they were building stone models of their palaces to take with them into the afterlife. It's a bit of high-end imperial vanity, really. A king who already lived in a palace wanted a stone version of that palace just to be safe. You, meanwhile, are just trying to make sure your actual, non-stone family has enough to eat before the sun goes down. As you resume the grinding motion, push, pull, rhythmic sigh, repeat, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps archaeologists bickering over their site maps: the engineering mystery. Historians are still locked in a heated debate over exactly how the Aksumites raised these 500-ton pillars without modern cranes or steel cables. Some argue they used massive earthen ramps and thousands of slaves, similar to the Egyptian method for the pyramids. Others point to the rugged, uneven terrain of the highlands and suggest a much more sophisticated system of pulleys, counterweights, and possibly even domesticated elephants. Academic historians are still debating this, often wondering if the Aksumites had some secret, lost technology for weight-bearing that we haven't rediscovered yet. To you, feeling the weight of a 20-pound muro in your hands, the answer seems obvious: they did it with a lot of people and an even larger amount of teff. The snarky part of your brain, the part that is currently checking your calluses, is pointing out the sheer irony of the view. Outside your window, you see a monument that represents eternal power, a stone that is meant to last for 1,000 years. But inside your house, you are working on a product that lasts for about 3 days. Your labor is ephemeral, it disappears the moment it's eaten. But without your temporary work, the permanent work of the carvers would stop. You are the energy source for the eternity happening outside. You notice a group of laborers walking past your house, heading toward the quarry. They look exhausted, their shoulders dusted with gray granite powder. You feel a sudden kinship with them. You're covered in purple dust, they're covered in gray dust. You're both grinding down the earth to satisfy the requirements of an empire. You speed up your pace, the muro clicking against the madga in a sharp, staccato beat. You're trying to sync your rhythm with the distant clink-clink-clink of the masons' hammers coming from the royal cemetery. It's a strange, industrial symphony. The whole city of Aksum is vibrating with the sound of stone on stone. You realize that your stone groove isn't just a personal meditation, it's the heartbeat of a capital city. If you were to stop, and if the woman in the next hut were to stop, the hammers in the distance would eventually fall silent too. You are the base layer of the imperial economy. The trade in gold and emeralds is the melody, but you, the grinder of grain, are the rhythm section. Here is a slightly quirky fact about the view from your window. The Aksumites believed that the stele were actually anchored into the underworld. They thought that the stone was a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. Some local legends even whisper that if a woman grinds her grain while staring at the royal stele, her flour will be heavier and more filling because it soaked up the prestige of the ancestors. You find yourself staring at the tallest obelisk, trying to catch some of that prestige. So far, all you've caught is a bit of a neck cramp and a fresh layer of dust on your eyelids, but you keep looking anyway. In a world this grand, you take your inspiration wherever you can find it. The sun is starting to tilt toward the west, and the shadow of the great Rome stele is stretching all the way across the marketplace. You look at your flour jar. It's nearly full. The purple-brown mountain of dust in your kitchen is starting to rival the stone mountains outside. You feel a deep, grounding sense of satisfaction. You've successfully moved your own monument through the morning. Your work isn't made of granite, and it won't be standing here in 2,000 years for tourists to take pictures of, but it's real. It's the monument of the meal. You take a final handful of teff and spread it across the stone. The seeds look like a tiny, brown ocean. You drive the muro forward one last time, feeling the basalt bite into the grain. The sound is muffled now, the stone and the flour having reached a state of perfect union. You realize that the shadow of the city isn't just an external thing. The city's history, its vanity, and its massive stone markers are all built on the quiet, repetitive persistence of people like you. You aren't just an observer of the Aksumite Empire, you are its architect. As the bells of the royal chapel begin to ring in the distance, you scoop the final gram of flour into the jar. The morning of the monuments is over. You stand up, your joints letting out a chorus of protests that sound like falling stones, and you look at the stele one last time. They are magnificent, yes. But they are silent. Your house, however, is full of the smell of life and the promise of the first fermentation. You've won the battle against the basalt. You've moved the mountain. You take a deep breath of the dusty, sun-warmed air and prepare to meet the water. The city of stone can have its eternity. You have your bread. You're leaning into the final few strokes of the morning, but your ears are working just as hard as your triceps. In the silence of the highlands, sound doesn't just travel, it carries. From where you're kneeling, you can hear the rhythmic scritch-scratch of your neighbor, Aklia, whose tukul is just a stone's throw away. Her stone sounds faster than yours, a frantic, percussive beat that suggests she's either in a massive hurry or she's got a particularly spicy bit of information to offload. You realize that you've entered the neighborhood social media phase of the day. In ancient Aksum, the grinding stone wasn't just a tool for making flour, it was the world's first high-speed fiber-optic cable for rumors. While the men are out in the marketplace discussing the price of frankincense, the real state secrets are being ground out right here, one dust mote at a time. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your dusty pocket is that Aksumite society was incredibly communal and interconnected. Unlike the sprawling, isolated farms of later European feudalism, Aksumite villages and cities were tightly clustered. Houses were built with shared courtyards or narrow alleys, designed specifically to foster a sense of collective security and social cohesion. This meant that the auditory landscape of a village was a shared experience. When you started your grind at dawn, you were effectively logging in to the local network. By the rhythm of your stone, everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly what stage of the morning you were in. If your stone went silent for too long, a neighbor would likely be at your door within minutes to check if you were sick, lazy, or, heaven forbid, out of teff. You pause for a moment, leaning your head toward the small window to catch the tail end of a shout from across the way. Here is a niche, slightly quirky fact for you: the grinder's telegram. In some parts of the Highlands, women developed a specific code using the pitch and tempo of their grinding stones. A slow, heavy thud might signal a period of mourning or a difficult harvest, while a high-speed, rhythmic, dancing beat could announce a pregnancy or a pending wedding in the family. It was a form of long-distance communication that predated the telegraph by over 1,500 years. You listen to Aklia's stone. It's currently hitting a triple-time beat that you recognize as the "Did you hear about the governor's new horse?" rhythm. You find yourself unconsciously speeding up your own grind just to show her you're interested. As you resume your work, your mind drifts to a point of intense academic controversy that keeps social historians arguing over their research grants, the domestic power debate. For a long time, historians looked at the Aksumite Empire and saw only the kings and the stonemasons, assuming the women at the grinding stones were a marginalized, subjugated class. However, a newer school of feminist archaeology argues that the grinding circles were actually the true nerve center of Aksumite political influence. They suggest that because the women controlled the food supply and the flow of community information, they held a soft power that could make or break a local leader's reputation. The debate is essentially, was the tukul a place of domestic confinement, or was it the actual situation room where the empire's social policy was negotiated? Looking at the way the rumors are flying through the air right now, you're starting to suspect the situation room theory is a lot closer to the truth. The snarky part of your brain, the part that's currently checking your notification tray for more gossip, is pointing out that your neighbor's data transfer speed is significantly better than yours today. She's already moved on to the news about the Roman merchant who arrived at the coast with a shipment of sour wine that turned out to be high-grade vinegar. You realize that in the 4th century, going viral meant that by the time you finished your third handful of grain, every person within a 3-mile radius knew exactly what you had for dinner last night. It's an exhausting level of transparency. You can't even have a quiet, private backache without someone 3 huts down offering you a root remedy for grinder's spine. You take a handful of teff and spread it across the stone, the seeds trickling through your fingers like a rain of data. You've noticed that your stone groove has become a bit more aggressive. You're no longer just grinding, you're commenting. You hit a particularly resonant note on the basalt to signify your skepticism about the Roman vinegar story. Thumpsrrk. Aklia responds with a series of sharp, staccato sweeps. Translation: I'm telling you, it's true, his camels are still at the gate. It's a beautiful, dusty conversation conducted entirely through friction and vibration. You realize that you don't need an internet connection when you have a basalt slab and a very thin stone wall. Here is a slightly weird fact about Highland gossip: because the teff dust stays in the air for so long, the ancient Aksumites believed that rumors literally lived in the flour. There was a superstition that if you talked too much while grinding, the lies would get caught in the grain and make the bread taste bitter. You find yourself closing your mouth tightly, not just to avoid inhaling the dust, but to make sure your future injera is as sweet as possible. You're practicing mindful grinding, a 4th century version of thinking before you tweet. You want your bread to be a record of truth, not a catalogue of village drama. The sun is directly overhead now, and the village soundscape is reaching its peak. You can hear the goats bleating, the children laughing, and the constant, underlying hum of 100 grinding stones. It's a comforting noise, a reminder that you are part of a giant, breathing organism. You aren't just a lone individual in a stone hut, you are a single node in a massive, mineral-based social network. You feel a sudden surge of affection for Aklia and her frantic stone. Even though she's driving you crazy with the governor's horse story, her rhythm is what keeps you moving when your arms want to quit. You scoop the last of the flour from the madga and pour it into your jar. The social media session is wrapping up for the morning. The rumors have been ground, the news has been shared, and the village has been synchronized. You stand up, feeling the blood rush back into your legs, and stretch your arms toward the roof. You've successfully processed a day's worth of grain and a week's worth of gossip. You're tired, you're covered in purple dust, and your head is full of stories about Roman merchants and royal horses. As you walk to the door to dump the last of the tefchaff into the wind, you catch Aklia's eye across the alley. She's doing the same thing. She gives you a quick, knowing nod, the universal sign for, "I'll tell you the rest at the water well." You smile back. The morning of the stone connection is over, and the afternoon of the water blend is calling. You've survived the neighborhood network, and now it's time to take all that ground-up information and turn it into something real. You take a deep breath of the mountain air, which is finally starting to clear of the dust, and prepare for the next step. The stone is silent, but the story is just beginning to bubble. You stop for a moment, letting the heavy basalt muro rest at the far end of the slab, and you do something you haven't done since the first bluish mist of dawn. You open your hands and really look at your palms. They are a sight to behold. If you were back in your own time, you'd probably be reaching for a bottle of high-end moisturizer and a set of bandages, but here, in the 4th century Highlands, your hands are starting to look like they've been replaced by 2 pieces of well-seasoned, mahogany-colored leather. The fine purple teff dust has been ground so deep into the lines of your skin that it looks like a permanent map of the Rift Valley. You run your thumb over the base of your fingers and feel that thick, hard ridge of skin, the history metal of the Aksumite woman. You realize that your hands have officially transitioned from being tools to being a living record of the empire's endurance. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your memory tonight is that the Aksumite Empire was a society where your physical CV was written on your body. While the elite were busy recording their genealogies on parchment or stone, the common people, the backbone of the civilization, had their life stories etched into their joints and skin. In Aksum, a woman's ability to grind teff was the ultimate metric of her social and economic utility. It was the fundamental skill required to sustain a household, participate in communal feasts, and contribute to the mahiber, the traditional social associations that held the fabric of the community together. Without these calloused hands, the elaborate social hierarchies of the empire would have simply crumbled. Your palms are the literal foundation upon which the city of Aksum sits. You rub your hands together, and the sound is more like 2 pieces of sandpaper meeting than human flesh. This leads us to a niche, slightly weird, and surprisingly practical fact for the night, the stone-hand connection. Master grinders in the Highlands claimed that they didn't even need to look at the stone to know when the grain was perfectly milled. They developed a thermal intuition in their calluses. Because basalt is such a dense volcanic rock, it holds the heat from the friction of the grind in a very specific way. A woman with enough experience could feel the microscopic temperature of the flour through her thickened skin. If the palms felt a certain, sharp heat, the flour was too dry. A muffled heat meant the grain was oily and ready for the vat. Your calluses aren't just dead skin, they are high-precision sensors that have been calibrated by 1,000 hours of volcanic friction. As you stare at the badges on your hands, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps bioarchaeologists and dietitians arguing over their spreadsheets, the stature paradox. When researchers look at the skeletal remains of the common people of Aksum, they find 2 conflicting stories. On one hand, the bones show the heavy wear and tear of a life of grueling manual labor, specifically the compressed vertebrae and enlarged shoulder attachments from grinding. But on the other hand, the chemical analysis of the teeth and bone density suggests that these people were among the most well-nourished populations of the ancient world. Academic historians are still debating this, often wondering how a population could be so physically overworked while simultaneously being so biologically robust. Were you a victim of a crushing domestic system, or were you essentially a 4th century super-athlete with a diet that gave you the bone density of a granite pillar? Looking at the strength in your own grip right now, you're starting to lean toward the super-athlete theory. The snarky part of your brain, the part that's currently comparing your ancient hands to your modern office hands, is pointing out that you couldn't use a smartphone right now even if you had one. Your Touch ID wouldn't recognize you, and you'd probably scratch the screen just by swiping left. You realize that in the modern world, we spend a fortune to keep our hands soft and unspoiled, as if any sign of labor is a secret shame. But here, A soft hand is a sign of someone who doesn't contribute, someone who is a burden on the grain stores. You feel a strange sense of pride in your history medal. These calluses mean that you have provided. They mean that you are a part of the long, unbroken line of people who have turned the mountain's grit into the city's life. You notice that Aklia, your neighbor, has stopped her stone too. She's standing by her door, stretching her fingers, and she catches you looking at your palms. She gives you a wide, knowing grin and holds up her own hands. They are even tougher than yours, the skin on her knuckles looking like the bark of an old acacia tree. She shouts something about a new batch of salt arriving from the Danakil Depression, but you're only half listening. You're mesmerized by the way the sunlight catches the fine teff dust trapped in her calluses. They look like they've been inlaid with copper. You realize that in this village, you don't read people's faces to know who they are, you read their hands. There is a slightly quirky bit of Aksumite lore about these grinders' metals. It was said that the spirits of the ancestors could only recognize their descendants in the afterlife by the pattern of their calluses. If you arrived at the gates of the sky with soft, smooth hands, the ancestors would think you were a stranger from the lowlands or a ghost from a different tribe. But if your hands were hard and stained with the purple dust of the teff, they would welcome you home as a true child of the stone. You find yourself unconsciously smoothing the skin over your knuckles, ensuring the pattern is deep and clear. You're essentially preparing your eternal passport, one stroke of the basalt at a time. The sun is beginning to drop, and the shadows of the tukals are stretching across the red earth like long, dark fingers. You look at your jar of flour, it's full. The work of the stone is finally, mercifully finished for the day. Your arms are heavy, your back feels like it's been tied in a knot, and your hands are vibrating with a phantom rhythm that you know will stay with you long into the night. But as you pour a little bit of clean water over your palms to wash away the top layer of dust, you notice how the water beads on the surface of your calluses. They've become almost waterproof, a biological shield created by the very earth you've been fighting. You realize that the Section 10 of your life has been about the physical transformation. You aren't the same person who walked into this hut at dawn. You have been ground down and built up, just like the teff. Your historical badge is a record of your presence in the story of Aksum. You've earned the right to move to the next phase. You've mastered the dry, the hard, and the heavy. Now, the story is about to get a lot more fluid. As the village prepares for the evening, you see the water-bearers returning from the spring, their clay jars balanced perfectly on their heads. The afternoon of the water is finally here. You take one last look at your basalt stone, which is now dark and silent in the shadows of the hut. It's done its job. You've ground the minerals, you've shared the gossip, and you've forged your badge. You take a deep breath of the air, which finally smells like damp earth and upcoming rain, and prepare to mix your purple mountain with the mountain spring. The stone groove is over, but the biological party in the fermentation jar is just about to start, the dust has finally settled. The air in your tukul is no longer a shimmering haze of microscopic teff, and for a few blissful minutes, you can actually see the texture of the stone walls without a reddish-brown filter. You're sitting by the storage jar, staring at that purple-tinted mountain of flour you've just spent half a lifetime grinding. It's a proud sight, but let's be honest, right now, it's just a jar of very expensive dirt. To make it into the legend of the Highlands, you have to invite a different element to the party. You reach for the large, heavy clay jar in the corner, the gone, and you hear a splash. It's time for the water blend. You're about to witness the moment when the dry, volcanic mineral dust of the mountain meets the cold, clear spring water of the valley. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your memory right now is that the Aksumite Empire was an absolute superpower in water engineering. While you're just carrying a jar from a local well, the civilization around you was built on massive dams, sophisticated reservoirs, and stone-lined cisterns that could hold millions of gallons. The city of Aksum wasn't just a place of tall stele, it was a hydraulic masterpiece designed to capture every drop of the seasonal monsoon rains. Without this mastery of water, the teff fields would have withered into dust, and your grinding stone would be nothing more than a very heavy paperweight. You are holding a piece of that infrastructure in your hands, liquid stability in an empire that knew how to tame the clouds. You pour the first stream of water into the flour. There is a sharp, percussive hiss as the dry grain absorbs the liquid. It's the sound of the teff waking up. You reach in with your hands, those calloused, history metal hands we talked about, and begin to mix. The sensation is startling. After hours of the dry, abrasive friction of the stone, the wet teff feels like liquid silk. It's cool, heavy, and incredibly smooth. Here is a niche, slightly quirky fact for you. The ancient Aksumites were very particular about the temperature of the mix. They believed that if the water was too cold, the soul of the teff would stay asleep, but if it was too warm, the bread would grow angry and sour too fast. Many women would test the water by holding it in their mouths for a few seconds first, ensuring it was exactly the living temperature of a human breath. You're essentially acting as a biological thermostat, calibrating the future of your dinner with the heat of your own skin. As your fingers swirl through the thickening batter, turning it from a dry powder into a deep, mahogany-colored cream, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps archaeological botanists arguing over their microscopes: the wild yeast mystery. Academic historians are still debating exactly where the first, starter for Injera came from. One school of thought argues that ancient Ethiopians meticulously cultured specific strains of yeast from the skins of local fruits or honey. However, another group of scholars insists that teff is so biologically unique that it carries its own, wild, fermenting agents right on the husk. They argue that you didn't need to add yeast, the grain was already pregnant with the spirit of fermentation, just waiting for the water to set it free. The debate is essentially, was the Aksumite baker a scientist who mastered cultures, or a witness who simply allowed the grain to do what it was born to do? Looking at the way the batter is already starting to feel alive under your palms, you're starting to think the grain has plenty of its own ideas. The snarky part of your brain, the part that is currently noticing how the wet teff is sticking to your arms like high-grade industrial cement, is pointing out that you are now officially a human whisk. Your forearm muscles, already humming from the grind, are now facing the resistance of several pounds of thick, starchy mud. It's like trying to stir a bucket of wet clay with your bare hands. You realize that hand blending is actually a very sophisticated form of aeration. You aren't just mixing, you're folding in the thin mountain air, creating the microscopic pockets where the yeast will eventually set up shop and start their bubbly party. If you don't mix it well enough, your injera will be a flat, sad pancake. If you mix it too much, it gets tough. You're searching for the Goldilocks texture, thick enough to coat your finger, but loose enough to ripple like a mountain stream. You notice the clay jar itself, the gon. It's a beautiful, dark-fired piece of pottery, its surface slightly porous. This leads us to a slightly weird but brilliant fact about Aksumite kitchen tech: the jar is part of the recipe. Because the clay is porous, it breathes. It allows the gases of fermentation to escape slowly while keeping the temperature inside stable. Some of the oldest fermentation jars in the village are said to have a memory of their own. After years of holding teff batter, the microscopic pores of the clay become a permanent high-rise apartment for the best types of bacteria. A family with an old jar is considered lucky because their bread will always have a deeper, more reliable sourness. You look at your own jar and wonder how many thousands of meals it has presided over. It's not just a container, it's a living biological partner. The sun is starting to dip, casting long, golden-red rays across the floor. The tukul is filling with a new scent, the smell of wet earth, malted grain, and a hint of the upcoming sourness. It's a clean, deep aroma that feels like it's grounding you to the floor. You've moved from the stone groove to the water waltz, and for the first time today, you don't feel like you're fighting the elements. You feel like you're cooperating with them. You realize that the section 11 of your life is the bridge. Without the water, the grain is just potential energy. With the water, it becomes an unfolding process. You lift your hands out of the jar, watching the thick, dark batter drip back into the pool. It makes a series of soft, musical plops. You wipe your arms with a bundle of grass, though the teff stain on your skin is likely there to stay until the next monsoon. You look at the jar, and it looks peaceful. The purple-brown liquid is still, reflecting the flickering light of the hearth. But you know that inside, that the microscopic party is just beginning. The lost seeds have been found, crushed, and now they are drowning in the valley's clear blood, ready to be reborn. You take a seat on the threshold of your door, watching the first stars appear over the stele of Aksum. You feel a deep, heavy exhaustion, but it's a good kind of tired. You've successfully translated the mountain's minerals into a fluid promise. You've survived the grind, the dust, and the social pressure of the neighborhood network. You realize that the water blend was the moment the work stopped being about you and started being about the bread. You're just the host now, the yeast is the guest of honor. You take a long drink of water yourself, feeling it cool your dusty throat, and prepare for the long, quiet wait of the night. The batter is tucked in, the jar is breathing, and the highlands are falling silent. Tomorrow, we'll listen for the bubbles. You're lying on your woven mat now, the cool night air of the Aksumite highlands whistling softly through the gaps in the stone walls. It's that deep, velvety hour of the night when the only thing awake should be the leopards on the far ridges and the guards at the palace gates. But as you stare up at the smoke-blackened rafters of your tukul, you realize the house isn't actually quiet. From the corner, where the large gone jar sits, comes a sound that is both tiny and relentless. It's a soft pop-hiss bloop. If you listen closely, it sounds like 1,000 microscopic travelers are having a very polite, very bubbly argument in the dark. Welcome to the Night of the Bacteria, the invisible celebration where the mountain dust and the valley water finally stop being ingredients and start becoming a living organism. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck under your pillow is that fermentation was the absolute survival hack of the ancient world. Long before we understood the existence of probiotics or gut biomes, the people of Aksum had mastered the art of biological preservation. Fermenting teff into a sour batter didn't just make it taste like the soul of the highlands, it actually predigested the grain for you. Teff is naturally high in phytic acid, which is a fancy way of saying it's a grain that likes to hold onto its minerals, specifically that iron and calcium we worked so hard to grind, and refuses to let your body absorb them. But when you let the batter sit in the dark for 3 days, the fermentation breaks that chemical bond. You aren't just making bread, you are performing a 4th-century act of nutritional alchemy that ensures your family grows as strong as the granite stele outside. You roll over on your side, and the scent hits you. It's no longer the dry, malty smell of the morning. Now, it's sharpening. It's becoming tangier, a bit yeasty, and deeply sour. Here is a niche, slightly weird fact for you. In the ancient highlands, the spirit of the fermentation was often carried from generation to generation through something called ursho. This is a small amount of liquid saved from a previous batch of successful batter, a literal biological heirloom. There are families in the empire who claim their ursho has been alive and continuous since the first kings of Aksum were crowned. You're currently hosting a microscopic colony that might be older than the house you're sleeping in. You aren't just baking dinner, you are babysitting an immortal ancestral guest that lives in a clay pot. As you listen to another bloop from the jar, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps food scientists and evolutionary biologists arguing over their sourdough, the eyes of the Injera mystery. Academic historians and scientists are still debating exactly which strain of yeast and bacteria is responsible for the unique, honeycomb, texture of Ethiopian bread. For a long time, it was assumed to be simple Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the stuff you find in modern beer. But recent studies suggest that traditional highland fermentation is a much more complex, chaotic symbiosis involving rare strains of Candida humilis and lactic acid bacteria that are found almost nowhere else on Earth. The debate is essentially, is Injera of bread, or is it a unique biological category that evolved specifically in response to the volcanic soil and thin air of the Rift Valley? Looking at the jar in the dark, you realize that the answer isn't in a textbook, it's currently eating your teff flour. The snarky part of your brain, the part that's currently noticing that you're essentially working, even while you're sleeping, is pointing out that waiting for batter to ferment is the 4th century equivalent of waiting for a massive software update to install on a slow internet connection. It's currently at 45% completion. You can't speed it up. You can't refresh the page. If the night gets too cold, the download stalls. If it gets too hot, the file gets corrupted and the bread turns into a vinegar-flavored tragedy. You realize that you've traded the physical pain of the grinding stone for the psychological tension of the fermentation vigil. You are a guardian of a biological clock that only ticks in bubbles. You notice the way the tukul feels different tonight. The house itself seems to be breathing with the jar. In Aksum, a house with a fermenting jar is considered a blessed house. The elders believe that the bubbles are the spirits of the grain rejoicing. There's a superstition that you should never argue or speak unkindly near the ghan, because the yeast are sensitive to the vibration of the home. If you have a bad heart, your bread won't have eyes. You find yourself consciously calming your breathing, trying to project a sense of peace toward the jar. It's an odd feeling, being emotionally manipulated by a pot of starchy mud, but in this world, if the bread fails, everything else feels a little more fragile. Here is a slightly quirky fact about your nighttime environment: because the fermentation releases carbon dioxide, a tukul with multiple jars on the go can actually become a bit of a sleeping chamber. The extra CO2, combined with the thin mountain air, can induce very deep, very vivid dreams. The priests of Aksum often claimed that their most profound revelations came after nights spent sleeping near the royal grain stores. You wonder what your dreams will look like tonight. Will you see the lost seeds? Will you hear the basalt stones singing? Or will you just see a giant, bubbly Injera floating over the Simeon Mountains like a savory cloud? The moon has reached its highest point now, and a sliver of silver light falls across the dirt floor. You see the surface of the batter in the jar. It's no longer a still pool of purple cream. It's moving. It's a churning, bubbling sea of microscopic ambition. The iron, the calcium, and the lost teff are all being broken down and rebuilt into something that can sustain a kingdom. You feel a strange sense of kinship with the bacteria. They're working hard in the dark so you don't have to work as hard tomorrow. It's a beautiful, silent labor-sharing agreement. You realize that the Section 12 of your journey is about the surrender of control. You did the hard part, the selection, the grinding, the pecking of the stone, and the water blend. But now, you have to let go. You have to trust the Wizard of the Highlands to handle the rest. You take a deep breath of the tangy, sour air, feeling it clear your head and settle your stomach. The pop hiss of the jar is a lullaby, a rhythmic reminder that the cycle of the earth is still turning even when you aren't pushing it. You pull your woven blanket tighter around your shoulders. The leopard on the ridge can wait. The king's gold can wait. The obelisk carvers can wait. Your only job now is to sleep and let the bubbles do their thing. The batter is growing, the ancestors are whispering in the Ursho, and the morning is still several thousand bubbles away. You close your eyes, matching your pulse to the steady beat of the fermentation jar, and let yourself drift into the mineral-rich dreams of ancient Ethiopia. The party in the corner continues, but for tonight, you are finally, blissfully, a guest. You wake up on the third morning, and the air in the tukul doesn't just smell like ancient history anymore, it smells like a very specific, high-stakes science project. The sharp, tangy aroma of the fermented teff batter is now so potent it could probably wake up the kings buried in the granite tombs down the valley. You roll off your mat and head straight for the ghan jar. You lift the lid, and instead of the heavy, purple mud of 2 days ago, you are greeted by a frothy, bubbling sea of liquid mahogany. It's alive. It's moving. It's slightly carbonated and deeply sour. This is the aha moment of the Highlands. The microscopic party we listened to in the dark last night has been a massive success. But now comes the part that makes the grinding look like a relaxing vacation. You have to face the fire. You walk over to the hearth in the center of the room. In front of you is the mitad, a massive, flat, circular griddle made of dark, fired clay. It's about 2 feet in diameter and rests on 3 sturdy stone legs over a bed of glowing embers. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your apron is that the mitad is one of the most enduring pieces of technology in human history. Archaeologists have found clay shards of these griddles in Aksumite ruins dating back nearly 2,000 years, and their design hasn't changed by even an inch. While the rest of the world was developing heavy iron pans or complex ovens, the Ethiopians perfected the art of the clay plate. Clay is a fantastic thermal regulator. It heats up slowly and distributes that heat with a gentle, even persistence that won't scorch the delicate lace of the bread. You aren't just cooking, you are performing a thermodynamic ritual on a 4th century ceramic stove. You start to stoke the fire, blowing gently through a hollow reed to wake up the embers. The mitad begins to groan softly as it expands with the heat. Now, here is your niche, slightly quirky, an incredibly clever fact for the night. How do you make a clay pan, non-stick, in the ancient world? You don't have Teflon, and you don't have butter. Instead, you reach for a small bag of gomenzer, wild rapeseed or mustard seeds. You wrap a handful of these oily seeds in a piece of clean cotton cloth to make a little pouch. As the griddle gets hot, you rub this pouch in rapid, concentric circles across the clay. The seeds release a microscopic film of oil that smokes and disappears into the pores of the ceramic. It's the original seasoning of the pan. If you do it right, the injera will slide off like a dream. If you do it wrong, you'll spend the rest of the afternoon scraping burnt purple glue off a hot rock. You can feel the heat radiating against your face, and your eyes are starting to water from the smoke, but you can't stop rubbing. This is the Highland non-stick miracle. As you prepare to pour the first circle of batter, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps culinary historians arguing over their research grants, the teff versus barley hierarchy. Academic historians are still debating whether teff-based injera was actually the national dish of the early Aksumite Empire, or if it was a luxury reserved for the elite. Some scholars argue that because barley is easier to grow in the cold, high-altitude fringes of the empire, the common people were likely eating barley-based flatbreads, which are heavier and less sour. They suggest that the pure teff, injera, was a symbol of the urban Aksumite identity, a way for the city dwellers to distinguish themselves from the barley-eating mountain tribes. The debate is essentially, did you grind all those seeds because everyone did, or because you were trying to maintain a specific, civilized, social status? Looking at the bubbling purple batter in your jar, you realize that for you, it isn't a status symbol, it's just the only thing that's going to satisfy your hunger. The snarky part of your brain, the part that is currently noticing that the clay griddle is now roughly the temperature of a small volcano, is pointing out that you are about to attempt the 4th century version of a high-speed precision art project. You pick up a small, spoutless ceramic jug filled with the thin, fermented batter. You have to pour this in one continuous, perfect spiral, starting from the outside edge and moving toward the center. You have to move fast. If you hesitate for even a second, the batter will set unevenly, and you'll end up with a lumpy, purple disaster instead of a beautiful lace-like sheet. You take a deep breath, steady your shaking hand, and pour. The batter hits the hot clay and instantly turns from a liquid into a bubbling, opaque film. It smells like a mixture of lemon juice and toasted popcorn. Now comes the watch of the eyes. As the heat travels through the batter, hundreds of tiny bubbles begin to pop on the surface, creating the iconic honeycomb texture known as ayin, or eyes. In Aksum, an injera without eyes is considered a failure, a sign that your fermentation was weak or your heart was troubled while you mixed it. You lean in close, watching the bubbles form in real time. It's a hypnotic process, a microscopic eruption of gas and steam. You quickly place a large, dome-shaped lid made of woven grass over the griddle to trap the steam. This is the final stage of the cook. The injera isn't flipped, it's steamed from the top and baked from the bottom. You count to 30. Your heart is thumping. You lift the lid, and a cloud of sour-scented steam engulfs the tukul. There it is. A perfect, circular, spongy sheet of bread. It's slightly purple, slightly translucent, and the eyes are looking back at you with absolute perfection. You use a flat, flexible piece of dried palm leaf to slide under the edge. The non-stick seeds did their job. The injera lifts away from the clay with a soft, papery shrrp sound. You move it to a large woven basket called a mezab, where it will cool and stay soft. You realize that the section 13 of your life is the moment of transformation. You've moved from the stone groove to the water waltz, and now you've finished the fire kiss. You aren't just a grinder of grain anymore, you are a master of the 4 elements. You've taken a handful of lost seeds and turned them into a biological miracle that can be folded like a piece of silk. You look at your hands. They are red from the heat, stained from the teff, and shaking from the adrenaline of the pour. You feel a deep, physical exhaustion, but it's accompanied by a massive sense of relief. You've done it. You've managed to software update the minerals of the highlands into the daily bread of the empire. You notice the sun is now at its peak, and the first few members of your family are starting to gather, drawn by the irresistible smell of the fresh injera. The first sheet is always for the spirits, but the second one? The second one is for the person who spent 3 days making it. You reach for the jug of batter again, ready to start the next spiral. The mitad is hot, the fire is steady, and the rhythm of the pour has taken over. You've survived the stone and the steam, and now, you are ready to feed a civilization. The obelisks outside can have their cold granite glory, you have the warm, bubbly soul of the highlands in your basket. You take a breath of the tangy air and pour. One more circle. One more spiral. The dance of the injera continues. You stand back from the mitad, the rhythmic hiss of the batter hitting the hot clay still echoing in your ears like a ghostly melody. The fire has settled into a deep, glowing orange, and the stack of injera in your mezab basket is now so high it looks like a pile of folded, purple-gray silk. But as you lift the final piece and watch the steam curl around your fingers, you find yourself staring intensely at the surface of the bread. You aren't looking for burnt edges or tears. No, you are looking for the eyes. In ancient Aksum, the thousands of tiny, microscopic craters on the surface of your injera aren't just a texture, they are a report card on your character, your skill, and your relationship with the unseen world. If the eyes are large and uniform, the gods are smiling. If the bread is smooth and flat, you might as well go back to the grinding stone and start your whole life over. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your apron is that the sponginess of injera is its greatest technological achievement. In a world where most ancient civilizations were eating dense, heavy loaves or dry, brittle wafers, the Ethiopians invented a bread that was essentially a high-performance biological sponge. Those eyes, or ayin, are the result of carbon dioxide bubbles being trapped in the viscous teff batter as it hits the heat. But their purpose isn't just aesthetic. The Aksumites realized that a flatbread with a high surface area was the perfect tool for a cuisine based on what? Thick, spicy stews. The honeycomb texture acts like 1,000 tiny reservoirs, soaking up the juices and spices so that not a single drop of the meal is wasted. You haven't just made a meal, you've engineered a piece of edible cutlery that is perfectly synchronized with the liquid mechanics of Ethiopian sauce. You pick up a piece of the cooling bread and tear a small strip. It's light, springy, and smells intensely of highland lemons and fermented earth. This leads us to a niche, slightly quirky, and very high-stakes fact, the ayin oracle. In the ancient highlands, the quality of a woman's ayin was a frequent subject of village gossip. If a young woman's injera consistently came out with tiny, blind eyes, it was rumored that she had a closed heart or was hiding a secret. Some elders even claimed they could read the future in the patterns of the bubbles, predicting the arrival of rain or the outcome of a distant trade mission by how the honeycomb formed on the mitad. You look at your own batch and realize you've produced some very talkative bread today. The eyes are wide, clear, and perfectly spaced. According to the village logic, you're basically a saint with a very bright future. As you arrange the circles of bread, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps culinary anthropologists arguing over their research grants, the Injera versus Kisra rivalry. Academic historians are still debating this, often bickering over whether the Ethiopian injera is the mother of all African flatbreads or if it was actually inspired by the Sudanese kisra, a similar fermented bread made from sorghum. One school of thought argues that the Aksumites, through their conquests of the Nile Valley, brought the bubbly technology back to the highlands and adapted it to teff. Others insist that the specific chemistry of teff and the unique, triple-stage, fermentation process used in Ethiopia is so complex that it must be an indigenous highland invention. The debate is essentially, is your dinner a copy of a Sudanese recipe or a purely Aksumite masterpiece? Looking at the purple tint of the grain, a color sorghum can never achieve, you're starting to side with the homegrown hero camp. The snarky part of your brain, the part that is currently noticing that your house smells like a very busy brewery, is pointing out that calling this bread is a bit of a stretch for a modern visitor. In any other culture, a soggy, sour, hole-filled gray sheet would be considered a kitchen disaster. Why is it so sour, the ghost of a Roman merchant might ask. You realize that the sourness is the entire point. It's the bite that cuts through the heavy fats of the meat stews and the earthy richness of the lentils. You've spent 3 days cultivating a specific level of acidity that would make a modern yogurt maker jealous. It's a flavor profile that is designed for the highlands, aggressive, deep, and unapologetically bold. You're essentially eating a preserved, predigested mineral cake that tastes like a lightning bolt. You notice that your neighbor, Aklia, has poked her head through the door. She doesn't say, hello, she just looks at the stack of bread. She reaches out and pinches the edge of the top sheet, checking the bounce. In Aksum, this is the ultimate social evaluation. If the bread stays compressed, it's a failure. If it springs back instantly, you've won the morning. Your bread snaps back like a piece of high-end rubber. Aklia gives a silent, begrudging nod and leaves. You smile. You've passed the Injera audit. You realize that the social pressure of the neighborhood network we talked about in Section 9 has finally reached its conclusion. The rumors have been ground, the water has been blended, the fire has been faced, and the results are undeniable. You are a master of the honeycomb. Here is a slightly weird fact about your cooling bread, because it is so high in iron and lactic acid, a stack of injera actually creates its own microclimate. If you keep them in the woven mezab, they stay soft and moist for days without growing mold. The fermentation that made it sour also turned it into a biological fortress. In a world without plastic wrap or refrigerators, your bread is its own preservative. You could take this stack into the desert for a week, and as long as you kept it in the basket, it would still be edible and nutritious. You aren't just a cook, you're a 4th century survivalist, packing a mineral-rich life raft into a grass basket. The sun is beginning to tilt toward the late afternoon, and the shadows of the steely outside are stretching toward your door like long, dark fingers. The tukul is quiet now, the heat of the midad fading into a comfortable warmth. You look at the pile of injera, hundreds of circles, thousands of eyes, and millions of tiny, lost, seeds that have finally found their home. You feel a deep, soul-level satisfaction. The labor of the stone and the tension of the fire have been translated into a physical reality you can hold in your hands. You aren't just a person anymore, you're the provider. You're the one who turned the mountains' basalt and the highlands' grass into the promise of a peaceful night. The snarky part of your brain reminds you that you still have to make the stew, but for now, you just want to sit on the floor and enjoy the sight of the honeycomb. You've survived the academic bickering and the biological party. You've turned the wizard grain into the spongy legend. You take a deep breath of the tangy, sour air, feeling your lungs finally clear of the teff dust. The Section 14 of your journey is the moment of realization, the bread is the map of your life. The holes are the challenges you've faced, the sourness is the grit you've shown, and the springiness is your ability to bounce back from the grind. You're ready for the final act. The sun is setting, the village is hungry, and the stars are coming out to watch the feast. You pick up the mezab, feeling the light weight of the history you've made, and prepare for the last communal meal under the Ethiopian sky. The sun has finally surrendered to the horizon, leaving behind a sky of bruised violet and deep indigo that matches the color of the red teff in your storage jar. You're sitting on a low wooden stool outside your tukul, your hands finally resting on your knees. The air has turned sharp and cold, a classic Highland night that makes you grateful for the thick stone walls and the embers of the hearth. In front of you sits the mezab, the colorful, hand-woven straw basket that serves as the centerpiece of the Aksumite home. You reach out and lift the conical lid, and a final, lingering puff of sour-scented steam rises to greet the starlight. The work of the last 3 days, the back-breaking grind, the watchful fermentation, and the precision of the pour, is now a tangible, edible reality. You aren't just looking at a meal, you're looking at a physical map of your own endurance. The mainstream historical fact you should hold close tonight is that the act of eating in ancient Ethiopia was the ultimate social glue. In the Aksumite Empire, as in modern Ethiopia, there was no such thing as a solitary meal. To eat alone was seen as a sign of deep misfortune or a suspicious lack of character. The mezab was designed to be shared, a communal table where the hierarchy of the palace and the simple life of the village met in a single circle. Every piece of injera torn, every scoop of spicy stew shared, was a reaffirmation of the social contract. You weren't just providing calories for your family, you were participating in a ritual of unity through the grain that has outlasted almost every other empire of the ancient world. You are part of a lineage of hospitality that makes a gold coin look like a very cold and lonely thing indeed. You tear a large piece from the edge of the injera, feeling that perfect, springy bounce we tested in section 14. You use it to scoop up a mound of spicy lentil stew, the honeycomb of the bread acting like a million tiny hands grabbing the sauce. This leads us to a niche, slightly quirky, and very efficient fact. In the world of the Highlands, the injera is the hero of the zero-waste lifestyle. It is the plate, it is the napkin, it is the spoon, and eventually, it is the stomach liner. In some Aksumite traditions, the very last piece of injera, the one that has sat at the bottom of the basket soaking up the juices of the entire meal, was considered the most spiritually charged portion. It was often reserved for the most honored guest or the person who had worked the hardest to bring the meal to life. You look at that bottom layer and realize that tonight, that piece is definitely yours. You've ground the basalt into it, you've earned every drop of that juice. As you chew, savoring the complex interplay between the sour teff and the earthy spices, you find yourself pondering the final point of intense academic controversy that keeps historians and sociologists debating in their ivory towers, the Injera identity theory. Academic historians are still debating whether the adoption of teff-based injera was the primary factor that allowed the Aksumite Empire to remain culturally distinct even as it converted to Christianity and traded with the Greco-Roman world. One school of thought argues that the teff diet was a biological fortress, a unique lifestyle that tied the people so closely to the highland soil that foreign influences could never truly take root. Others argue that the diet was simply a practical response to the environment and that the identity part was a much later romantic invention. The debate is essentially, did the teff make the empire, or did the empire just happen to like the teff? Looking at the massive stone obelisks in the distance, you're starting to think the grain was the stronger of the two. The stones might fall, but the bread is forever. The snarky part of your brain, the part that is currently noticing that you are too tired to even lift your arm for the next bite, is pointing out that you have successfully transformed into a 4th-century teff-sculpted athlete. Your arms are solid, your back is made of tempered steel, and you have enough mineral-rich blood in your veins to power a small forge. You realize that you have officially graduated from being a modern visitor to being a person of the stone. You look at your hands in the moonlight. The purple dust is still under your fingernails, and the calluses on your palms feel like a secret armor. You don't need a monument to remember this day. Your body is the monument. You perform the final act of the meal, the gursha. This is a slightly weird but deeply moving tradition where you tear a perfect piece of bread, wrap it around the best piece of food, and hand-feed it to the person sitting next to you. It's an act of absolute trust and intimacy. You feed your neighbor, and they feed you. In that moment, the exhaustion of the morning's grind evaporates. You realize that all that labor wasn't about the lost seeds or the heavy rock. It was about this, the moment when the work becomes a gift. The stone groove and the water waltz were just the rehearsals for this final, quiet performance under the stars. Here is one last quirky fact about the Aksumite night. The elders believed that the smell of a well-fermented injera was so pleasing to the spirits that it acted as a protective shield for the home. They said that as long as the sour scent lingered in the thatch, the spirits of the drought would pass by and leave the house in peace. You take a deep breath of the air, which is now a heavy, comforting mix of sour malt, wood smoke, and the cold mountain wind. You feel safe. You feel anchored. You are a citizen of the highlands, tucked into the protective embrace of a volcanic empire. The moon is high now, casting long, silver shadows across the obelisk plaza. The village is falling silent, the sound of 100 grinding stones replaced by the low murmur of families settling onto their mats. You place the lid back on the mezab, feeling the rough straw under your fingers. You've ground the minerals of the earth into the fuel of the soul. You've moved the mountain, one handful of tiny seeds at a time. The lost tef has been found, transformed, and shared. You stand up, your joints letting out one last, respectful series of cracks. You walk into your tukul, the warmth of the embers welcoming you home. You lie down on your mat, the smell of the tef still clinging to your skin like a fragrant promise. You've survived the stone. You've survived the fire. You've survived the rumors and the history. You are full, you are strong, and you are finally, gloriously, done for the day. You close your eyes, the rhythm of the muro still humming in your bones, and let yourself drift into the mineral-rich darkness of an Aksumite sleep. The empire is safe. The bread is made. And the stars are watching over the highlands. Now, let the world of ancient Aksum begin to soften and fade at the edges of your mind. The sound of the grinding stone and the hiss of the clay griddle are becoming distant, gentle echoes, disappearing into the vast, silent canyons of the Simeon Mountains. Imagine the purple-brown dust of the tef turning into a soft, warm mist that wraps around you like a heavy wool blanket, keeping out the mountain cold and welcoming in the stillness of the night. You are no longer the motor of the house. Your hands are resting now, the phantom weight of the basalt and the tension of the pour finally lifting from your spirit. The long, rhythmic days of the highlands are folding themselves up like a piece of soft injera, tucking you into a deep and velvety darkness. You don't have to watch the bubbles or tend the fire anymore. You are safe. You are warm. You are drifting on a tide of ancient minerals, moving slowly toward the edge of a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. The tukul is dark, the stele are silent in the moonlight, and the empire is at rest. There is nothing left to grind, nothing left to mix, and nothing left to wait for. The rhythm of the highlands is now the steady, slow rhythm of your own breath. You are a part of the history, you are a part of the mountain, and you are finally at peace. Everything is in its place. The basket is full. The story is told. Sleep now, feeling the weight of the iron in your blood and the wisdom of the stone in your heart, and let the silence of the night carry you home. The story ends here. Good night.